Earlier this year, I collected a lot of acorns to make dye, and I got to wondering what else one could do with acorns. So as usual, I went on the internet and I found that you could actually eat acorns, you just have to process them first. The reason you want to process acorns before you eat them is to leach the tannins out of them, which is exactly the reason that I wanted them for dye, because tannins react with iron to create dark grays and blacks. But tannins aren't really something that you want in large quantities in your body. These are clearly some form of white oaks. I can tell because these are round lobe leaves and not pointy leaves, which would be red oak leaves. Oak trees do what's called mast fruiting, which basically means that they create a bumper crop of acorns one year, and then for the next year or two they may not produce so many. Usually this applies to all of the oak trees in a certain region, and they kind of communicate with each other to keep the rodent population down because otherwise they'd be overrun. I also found out that only 1 in 10,000 acorns is probably going to turn into an oak tree, which explains why oak trees create so many acorns. So apparently there's some oak trees that have acorns that sprout in the spring and some that sprout in the fall. These are clearly ready to start growing now. This means that the starch in them has already started to convert into sugar, which I imagine just means that they might taste a little bit sweeter. This little hole means that there was once a weevil grub inside of this acorn, and it ate all of the meat inside of it, so this is no good for me. I've tried to crack a couple of these now. This is going to be a really annoying process, but they're definitely more annoying to crack because they're not dry. So I've decided to stick them in the oven to dehydrate them. But first I'm going to put them in this pot of water to see which ones are good and which ones are bad, because the good ones will sink and the bad ones should float. Because most of them are sprouting, I'm pretty sure that most of them are good, but never hurts to check, yeah, because there's a couple floaters. I've set this on a fan setting with the thought that moving air is probably good for dehydrating stuff, and I've set it also to 50 degrees Celsius because that's as low as it goes. I tried these for a total of about 9 hours yesterday, and I kept rotating them. I know a lot of them have cracked open. They're also quite sticky and they're still slightly damp. I just didn't really want to do it anymore because they're turning brown, which I think is because they're oxidizing, but I'm also not sure if that means I'm cooking them. Some of these are totally white on the inside, and others have this like brown patch. And some of them are totally brown, like this one. I'm pretty sure it's just oxidation because this one just broke, and it's brown, but it's white where it hasn't been exposed to air. They make this super satisfying popping noise when you crack them. Whew. It's so nice. Acorns have this skin on the inside of their shell called the testa, and dehydrating the acorns helps that to come off with the shell instead of it sticking directly on the acorns. Supposedly red oak acorns are also much more difficult to get the testa off of, but so far there's only been a couple where it sticks. Hallelujah. These have been sitting here now for about 24 hours and they've all turned a super dark brown, which is cool because that's kind of what they do when they react with iron and dye. The next step in this process is leaching, which is why I'm knitting these bags. This one was too small, so I'm adding a little bit onto it. The point of leaching is to remove the tannins from the acorns. Turns out that squirrels do this a little bit by burying the nuts and then they leach into the ground. But I'm going to do it by using water. You can do it by hot or cold water. Hot water takes a lot less time, but you run the risk of possibly cooking the starches in the acorns, and you also lose a bunch of nutrients that way. And apparently cold leaching is much better for flour, which is mostly what I'm aiming for. Most people do this by letting the acorns sit in a jar of water and then pouring off the water every so often. But one of the traditional ways to do it is actually by putting it in a stream. Apparently you can also do it in your toilet tank, which I thought was a brilliant idea, except that I thought that perhaps the tannic acid in the acorns would slowly degrade the parts of the inside of your toilet. And the toilet that I'd be subjecting this to is not mine, so I decided to go outside with this method. I don't really know how long this is going to take, and I'm going to have to taste the acorns to know when they've stopped being bitter. White oak acorns have a lot less tannin in them than red oak acorns, so this should make the process significantly faster. I just thought to try one of these. It's surprisingly not bitter, although definitely a little bit. It's got that like astringent tannin taste to it, but it's quite like a fruity taste, and that I wasn't expecting. I've elected to put my acorns in 2 different spots so that if one gets moved, it's not the end of the world. I put this nice little sign on it that says, "Please don't disturb science project," so hopefully that will deter anybody. Now I'm going somewhere over there. It's been about a week and I just tasted one of these. It's definitely a lot less bitter, but it's still not quite there yet. It's starting to freeze and I'm afraid they're gonna turn these things off. So I came here to rescue my acorns. It's so cool. Still tannic. Okay, more time for you. They won't shut this one off. They're still here. I'm really hoping they're done because I'm running out of time to deal with these. Oh, there's a hole in one of the bags. I wonder if some animals have been getting at these. Let's taste test. They're still very slightly tannic. And because of my time constraint, I'm going to take these with me anyway and see what I can do. I'm going to dump all of these acorns into this pot because the bags are super dirty, so they're just releasing super dirty water into whatever I rinse it with. I want to know if these are cleanly leached, so I need to see if the water comes out clear, but obviously if the bags are dirty, I can't really tell. It's alive! I think he's a baby earthworm. I'm leaving these to sit in warm tap water overnight. The water still isn't rinsing particularly clear, but like I said, I have no idea if that's dirt or tannins. So I'm going to say that if it's darker in the morning, then I know that there's still a lot of tannins left in there. I left these overnight, and this water is still super, super dark. I probably should have done this a long time ago, and then I wouldn't be having this problem now. But I'm hoping that if they're chopped up smaller, the tannins will leach out faster. This is about to get a lot more efficient. Ugh, acorn mud. I poured off some of the water into this bowl and let it sit overnight to see how it would settle out. And then I poured the top layer of liquid off of it, and what I'm left with is this stuff, this like delightful goo. It's acorn starch, and apparently you can also use this to make gelatin, and they do this as a Korean dish. It's called dotorimuk. I ground these up like 5 days ago, and I've been leaching them multiple times a day since then. Clearly the water is still not coming out clear, which is quite impressive. And now I have to move. So if I had known about this ahead of time, I should have ground these up first to make this acorn meal and then put them in like really fine mesh bags and then put them in the mountain stream. Looks like a standard jar of nut butter, right? This is getting ever so slightly ridiculous. I've been here for over a week now, and this has been constantly soaking since then. I've changed the water out multiple times a day, and somehow it is still not running completely clear. I think it's been like pretty much 2 weeks since I ground these up. I'm just assuming there's still tannins in here because it's not clear water coming out. It's definitely a lot better than it was. Normally I would just let these sit for a while longer and keep changing the water, but I'm running up against yet another time constraint, so it's time to apply heat. I'm gonna try and not bring these to a boil. I think I'm gonna try and keep the temperature relatively low, but we'll see how attentive I am because I have a tendency to wander off and do other things while stuff is on the stove. It's been about an hour and the water is already this dark. I'm gonna change it pretty much every hour now for the next little while. I'm very much starting to wonder if the color that I'm pulling from this is not actually tannins anymore, because these have more or less been leaching steadily for 5 weeks, and that's like far on the outside of any sort of time that anyone on the internet suggested. So I figured the best thing for me to do was actually to taste the liquid to see if there were tannins still left in them. It looks kind of gross, to be honest. I'm gonna let that cool for a second. No, it just tastes like tea. So what is this color? I should definitely have tasted that before. Okay. People on the internet were definitely lying about the water going clear. This means that I actually have to dry the acorns finally. They definitely turned a lot darker with the heat. Ooh, they're very oily, which is true. Acorns have a very high fat content, which is why they could possibly go rancid very quickly. I'm gonna turn on the oven and do the same drying process all over again. Looks really more like dirt than anything else. Lucky me, I don't have a blender. So I guess I'm going to be grinding these by hand with a mortar and pestle. Here goes the next few hours of my life. I'm doing this against the armchair now because I'm pretty sure that the neighbors can hear me loud and clear when I do it on the counter, since it seems to just amplify everything. It's not particularly fine. I don't believe it, but I think I've actually reached the stage where I can start to make bread. 150 grams. These ones do not have gluten in them, so I have to mix it with normal flour. Most recipes online I'm seeing are using kind of like a half-half deal. This is just going to be my normal bread recipe, but with half acorn flour. Some people are saying that it's no good to use acorn flour that's been hot bleached, but I have no idea what that means or what it would do. I figure I have at least 2 shots at it. This is fresh yeast. I was gonna start at 75% hydration, but I think I'm gonna add quite a bit more water. I have no idea what percentage hydration this is actually gonna be at, but I figure the first one I'm gonna do by feel, and the second one I'm actually gonna know what I did. I left this for an extra long outer because I thought that the acorn flour needed a lot of time to soak up the water. This is just salt and water that I normally put in at this point anyway. I think I'm gonna put in a little bit extra water just because it still seems cracker dry. So usually at this stage I can really like pull the dough and stretch it, but obviously there's not enough gluten in this to actually hold it together. I will not be surprised if this thing turns out very brick-like, because I'm not even sure that the yeast will be able to lift it enough without a gluten structure. You can kind of see like strands of gluten. I'm wondering if 50% acorn flour was too much to actually turn this into something bread-like. I've been eating this for about 10 minutes now, which is usually about how long it takes for me to develop the gluten structure in normal bread. I'm wondering how much of a difference it would have made if the flour were finer. Yeah, it's gonna be a brick. It's been about 8 hours, which is how long I've been leaving my bread for the last couple weeks in this apartment. It's sort of fluffier, but I don't know. Oh, well, maybe. I'm gonna be surprised if I can actually like shape this like I normally do, but I'm at least gonna try. This is so strange. Normally I do this with a scraper, but I think I'm just gonna keep tucking it under. I will let that rest, I guess. This has been sitting here for about 45 minutes now. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just making a pattern because actually this bread is able to be cut through. Standard bread procedure, the pot is already heated. Now the $1,000,000 question, did it rise? Ooh, it kind of did. It's an acorn brick. I'm actually quite surprised that it split at the seams where I scored it. Also sounds like bread. It is very dense and weighty. I'm going to let this cool before I cut into it. The moment of truth has arrived. Oh brother. It's definitely dense. I mean, there's kind of a crumb. It's not very puffy, but you know, that's to be expected. I mean, it acts like bread, it looks like bread, it smells like bread, so it must be bread. Interesting. Wow, it's actually good. It's got this like olive oily taste to it. Huh. Who knew? Okay, so I didn't do everything wrong. I think I can call this bread. It's very slightly sweet. Definitely the texture can be improved. It's actually edible. In the end, I have no idea what hydration this was. I'm gonna guess like at least 85%. I'm gonna make another loaf, but with 25% acorn flour instead of 50% like this one was. And hopefully it will be a bit fluffier, and I'll have better control over the hydration as well. Second loaf. This is the 25%. It was in the fridge overnight, and I took it out a few hours ago so it could warm up. It's definitely a different texture than the last one. It's still more solid than most bread that I usually make, but I'm going to be able to shape it much better, I think. Very strange. It kind of does. Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna call that shaped. Loaf number 2, also quite hard. Definitely smells like bread. Definitely sounds like bread. Definitely a little lighter than the last one, which should be nice. This was loaf number 1, quite dark, quite dense. This is loaf number 2, also dense, but not quite as much. Definitely this is the winner. Usually I eat bread quite quickly, but I actually had a small piece of this earlier, and it's super dense and filling, and I'm guessing that's because of the high fat content of the acorns. So it's not something I would necessarily want to eat a lot of, especially in one sitting. I've learned several things from this experiment. I feel like this project was only a mild success because I was terribly inefficient and I had to throw out a lot of my acorns. But I'm quite pleasantly surprised by the fact that I actually have acorn bread and it actually tastes good. Really what I needed for this project was time, taste, and tools. More time would have been nice if I didn't have to change places, and then I wouldn't have had to throw out so much of it. Although, as I can see, a little bit of acorn goes a long way. I should have just been tasting more often so that I would be relying on the taste instead of the color of the water, because obviously the color of the water comes from something else, not just the tannins. Appropriate tools would have also made this job a lot easier. I think I would have been able to get the acorn meal much finer after it was dried up, which would have yielded a much more flour-like consistency because it's still quite rough. And I also would want to see the difference between cold leaching and hot leaching, because since I did kind of a combination between the two, I'm not really sure what this ended up as. So next time I know, I'll grind them up first before I soak them, and then just leave them in cold water and then taste them to know whether or not they're ready.